My name's Alan Baker. I'm the head of the legal international law program at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs and the Institute for Contemporary Affairs at the Jerusalem Center. Welcome to this very interesting Zoom seminar, which is basically launching a very interesting booklet edited or written by my very talented colleague Fiamma Nirenstein, who I'll introduce shortly, on the double message, double standard inherent in institutions and states that are abandoning the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and the message being that in doing so, they're basically courting danger. A couple of words on my own behalf. Anti-Semitism today is a melange, a mixture of the age-old classical old-style anti-Semitism, which has been in existence for thousands of years, with all the associated tropes and stereotypes and blood libels, false accusations, evil cartoons. All this always has existed and still exists. And we can add to this a convenient and pseudo-legitimate expression of anti-Israelism as a very shallow and artificial cover for good old anti-Semitism. This has been slowly reverberating since the establishment of the State of Israel, through the aftermath of the Six-Day War and Israel's entry into the territories, with a myriad UN political resolutions adopted every year, 15, 20 resolutions, and you don't need to do the math to come to thousands of resolutions adopted by automatic majorities, contributing to strengthening and solidifying this mixture of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. The UN Durban International Conference to Combat Racism in 2001, which I can't say I had the pleasure, but I attended it as part of the Israeli delegation, which after a few days got up and left together with the Americans. This international conference, which is about to celebrate, quote unquote, its 20th anniversary with a parallel UN meeting, which several states have already announced they're boycotting. This enabled a huge collection of anti-Israel non-governmental organizations to hold their own parallel Durban forum, going on at the same time as the interstate forum, and basically to formalize the equation of anti-Semitism with anti-Israelism. And the plan of action and declaration that they negotiated and published since then has been one of the basic tenets of modern day anti-Semitism. The 2016 IHRA, quote, non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism. I was always puzzled by this title, which in my opinion is a self-defeating title. The IHRA definition attempts to formalize this mixture into one universally accepted concept incorporating the classic and modern faces of anti-Semitism, and being one, enabling action by states and by organizations against isn't perfect. The title itself is a form of compromise, obviously. It indicates its inherent weakness. It's a compromise aimed at attracting maximal support, which is what compromises are. And they usually have to try and find the lowest common denominator in order to get the maximal amount of support. Since it's not a legally binding definition, and I, as an international lawyer, value anything that is distinctly legally binding that states can adopt and commit themselves to, since it's not a legally binding definition, it doesn't have teeth. And hence, countries can and do glibly and easily identify with it, which doesn't cost them anything, but without actually actively and seriously implementing it. This is what Fiamma Nirenstein, in her excellent study, calls double messaging and a double standard. Because they not only do not actively implement it, despite having identified with it, but they even permit public expressions against Israel. They vote against Israel. They criticize Israel in such a manner as, to all intents and purposes, to completely undermine and upturn the IHRA working definition. And so I welcome you all to this meeting. I welcome all the participants in launching Fiamma Nirenstein's booklet. And who better to do this than the speakers who I'll now introduce. My friend, Professor Gerald Steinberg, founder and president of NGO Monitor, whose work traces and displays the very source of those elements undermining the IHRA definition. My friend and colleague here at the Jerusalem Center, Dan Diker, director of the project to counter BDS and political warfare at the JCPA, former Director General of the World Jewish Congress, and my very good colleague and friend, Fiamma Nirenstein, former journalist, still journalist, former Vice President of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Italian Chamber of Deputies, former chair of the Committee for the Inquiry into Anti-Semitism at the Council of Europe, and now working with us at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. So I'm very honored and happy to give the floor now to my friend, Professor Gerald Steinberg. Thank you.
Alan, thank you for that wonderful introduction. You've also saved me a couple of minutes by putting some of the background on the table. And as you mentioned the Durban conference, and you were there on the ground. And that's going to be a major focus of what we're going to be seeing and doing for the next couple of months. The UN wants to do a fourth Durban celebration on September 22nd. And the same NGOs will be out there beating the drums, doing the same accusations of apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing and war crimes. And that's 20 years. And all of this makes the importance of the IHRA working definition, really highlights it, something which I'll talk about in a minute. I also want to congratulate Fiamma for really doing an amazing job. The timing of this booklet is extremely important. The fight over, against, and the counterattack to try to maintain the consensus around the IHRA working definition is very much on the table right now. So I'm very honored to participate in this, and I look forward to both Dan Diker's comments and Fiamma's summary. Fiamma rightly highlighted the fact that the formal adoption of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, while in and of itself is important, it will have little impact if it's not implemented. If it's just a form of virtue signaling, it's not going to go anywhere, and we're going to continue to see rising anti-Semitic attacks, particularly in the form of we're only opposed to Zionism, we're only being anti-Israel, and that's, of course, entirely legitimate. There's nothing wrong, they say, in comparing Israel to the Nazis, for example, or for singling out Israel, calling Israel a racist apartheid state, which is the flavor of the month, particularly by Human Rights Watch and many other NGOs. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some of the specifics that we see in terms of the attack against the IHRA working definition. And I'm now going to share my screen and do what I do best, which is let my PowerPoint do the talking. I want to start with definition, one of many. There are many definitions of anti-Semitism, or there are variations on the term anti-Semitism. This is a relatively old one. Some of you may recognize it. It's from Voltaire. Voltaire this is the Enlightenment, one of the great French philosophers, but he had a particular issue with Jews. And his essay, We Must Take Sides, and he talks about all sorts of different, what we would now call ethnic groups, religions. And on the Jews, he says, you have surpassed all nations in impertinent fables, in bad conduct and in barbarism. You deserve to be punished, for this is your destiny. Now, we all start, right? Alan, you were at Durban, and many of us started. NGO Monitor started essentially at Durban. That's with the NGO Forum. I believe you and I had a number of conversations immediately afterwards about this, including in Ottawa, I believe. But just the terms that Voltaire gives us are reflected in the Durban NGO Forum Final Declaration. What's the bad conduct? Israel is a racist apartheid state. Israel's brand of, and apartheid was the flavor of the week, of the month. Human Rights Watch just came out with a 200-page report that said that Israel has now crossed the line. Well, they said the same thing 20 years ago, and it's embodied in this final declaration from Durban. Barbarism is the war crimes, the acts of genocide, Israeli systematic perpetration of racist crimes and barbarism, and punishment is to call on the international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state, which, as Professor Erwin Kotler often says, is a form of saying Israel should be wiped off the map. What do you do with an apartheid state? You don't allow it to exist. And just to illustrate this, and I'll do this very quickly because I want to get back to the IHRA definition, but here's what came out just a couple of months ago. You have the Human Rights Watch report, which they say a threshold crossed, 200 plus pages, where they use the word apartheid 200 times. And then they say, no, we weren't really talking about South African apartheid. We invented a new term of apartheid, which anybody who buys that, I won't even use the Brooklyn Bridge analogy. It's complete nonsense. Then you have the front page coverage, or the main coverage they get in the New York Times, across the international media. This is important, they say, because Human Rights Watch said it is, because Israel's an apartheid state. Out of Durban, and I think that's one of the most important results of Durban, the implications of Durban, there was an awakening. And part of that awakening, it did lead directly to the working definition. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, after this was part of a broader discussion in the early years, right after Durban, again, we're talking about 19, 20 years ago, was the beginning of the process where a number of individuals, Erwin Kotler, Mark Weitzman, and others, many others, Michael Wine, there's a list, all said we have to come up with a definition of anti-Semitism in order that we can identify this kind of behavior as clearly what it is. And that was the beginning that led to, in 2016, the adoption of this working definition, and the language is right here. I won't read it. Most of you are familiar, and if you're not, it's something that you should be familiar. It's 4 examples, and as has been said, they are not legally binding. This is not something that is directly part of some sort of legal process, but it allows anybody who cares about anti-Semitism to classify. So you don't have these cases, well, we don't know somebody was killed, and we don't know whether it was an attack because it was anti-Semitic. We can't collect statistics. We can't identify. Here's some clear examples of modern anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism. And I think the success is that over the years, over the last 5 years, it's been adopted quite widely. Again, that gets back to Fiamma's main point that the definition is important, but it needs to be implemented. It needs to be more than just pious words. And so here we have an example of the type of impact that it's had. It's adopted by more than 30 countries. Most recent was with Switzerland. Switzerland's an interesting case because there's a real question as to whether they have any intention of actually implementing it. And they did adopt it in the last few months. It has been adopted and in many cases implemented in 250 local councils. This is old, probably the numbers have gone up in the UK, and importantly, close to 30, maybe now 30 universities. I think one of the reasons we're seeing the big pushback against the IHRA working definition is that it has been successful. When Cambridge University adopted it last year, and before that, the Parliament in Canada, when it was discussed, it wasn't adopted, but it was at least discussed in a UN report on anti-Semitism by Ahmed Shahid, and that was very important. When the Biden administration very explicitly re-endorsed the working definition, despite and in opposition to campaigns from the progressive woke wing of the Democratic Party, that's important. And I think equally important, perhaps more important, and I'll talk about this again at the end, is that in contrast to the tendency to simply use the IHRA working definition as a form of virtue signaling, the European Union published a handbook for the practical use, implementation of the working definition, and that was just a few months ago. And I believe that if one looks at the timing of the campaign against the working definition, this is a significant part of the process. Now, what is the opposition to the working definition? Fiamma identifies it very clearly. The denial of the link between anti-Semitism and the systematic condemnation and institutional persecution of Israel. When you have Peter Beinart, I'll give some more examples in a minute, a number of individuals and organizations who have adopted the campaign slogan, and it's really a slogan, that the IHRA working definition prevents legitimate criticism and free speech against Israel. I use the term canard, it's even maybe a stronger term like lie should be used here. And as Fiamma wrote in her book, many, if not most, local, national, and international institutions are unable, and I add to that, they deliberately, in some cases, refuse to distinguish between freedom of speech and anti-Semitism. It's a convenient excuse. We don't have to call this anti-Semitism. We don't have to comparing Israel, the behavior of the IDF to Nazi Germany. We don't have to say that's anti-Semitism. We don't have to say that Israel does not, the Jewish people don't have the right to self-determination there, or an apartheid state. We don't have to call that anti-Semitism. That's simply legitimate criticism. And they don't, I think in many cases, it's a matter of they don't want to make the effort to distinguish because you have to fight for it. Now, today, the main source of opposition, and I think in many ways the main threat to legitimacy of the IHRA working definition, is the so-called Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. It came out with a lot of noise a few months ago. It got a lot of media attention. And what it is an alternative text. They say, put the IHRA working definition aside. Here's another one, and it's better because it doesn't have a problem with free speech. And why? Because it drops almost all of the examples that have to do with Israel and Zionism, including the example of comparing Israel to Nazi Germany, and including the denial of the right of Jewish people to self-determination, and including the prohibition on double standards not required for other democratic societies, singling out Israel and not using those standards in any other case. So they came up with this thing called the Jerusalem Declaration. And they say that it had 200 signatories, and they did a big campaign. I won't go through the details, but you'll notice that in my headline here, I call it the Berlin working definition. The Jerusalem Declaration is a deliberate sleight of hand. Yes, there were some sessions at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, held some meetings, and the people there, some of them are signed on to the text, but it's really something that was clearly hatched, born, and marketed out of Berlin. And I will now, as I go to the next slide here, give you some of the reasons for that. There it is, okay? Here they say that in 220, a group of scholars in anti-Semitism studies and related fears. Well, if you look, by the way, at some of the signatories, Richard Falk is one of the signatories of this Jerusalem Declaration. He is certainly not a scholar in anti-Semitism studies, or Jewish studies, or Holocaust studies, or Palestine and Middle East studies. He is one of the perpetrators of some of the most virulent anti-Semitism while he was a special rapporteur, among other things, at the United Nations Human Rights Council. But if you look at the coordinating group, there are 8 names here. 3 of them are Germans. 2 of them are, I think 2 or 3 of them are Israelis. There's a combination, some of you will recognize the names. The most, I would say, not necessarily prominent, but the most visible here is a woman by the name of Stephanie Schuler-Springorum, professor, director of the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism, Technische Universität Berlin. According to that, the members of the staff at this Center for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin, and particularly for Stephanie Schiller-Springorum, the only or the main source of anti-Semitism is the right wing. There is no anti-Semitism left, and if you look at their publications and particularly at her statements, you'll see that there's no recognition of any form of left-wing anti-Israel anti-Semitism. It just doesn't exist. And she also was involved, along with the other two signatories of this, in the what was called the Declaration of German Cultural Leaders on the issue of the BDS movement. If you look at this whole process of attacking the IHRA through this alternative declaration or definition, you see a lot of evidence of the way in which this was pushed by, initiated by, run by, and I believe probably largely written by the three, and those are the only ones that are visible, there are other Germans involved as well, 3 out of 8 of the so-called Jerusalem Declaration. If, for instance, one of the things is that when they're in their announcements, this was a big public relations campaign. It was the second one. I go back to what I started to say earlier. A couple of months earlier, a number of the same people in Berlin came out with a major statement. It was a whole orchestrated public relations campaign. The New York Times headline, I think, summarizes it best. German cultural leaders warn against ban on Israel sanctions movements. The Bundestag had passed a resolution that stated that BDS was a form of anti-Semitism and cited the IHRA working definition, among other things. And then, this was a couple of years ago, and then some Germans on the far left, perpetual anti-Israel campaigners, as part of their very fringe left-wing political ideology, condemned this attempt by the Bundestag to label BDS. They didn't outlaw it, they just labeled it as a form of anti-Semitism. And they said this was a form of banning free speech, and they called themselves cultural leaders. And over 100 initially signed it, or I think on the original number was 30, and then it increased. They kept adding more people. The same people who put that out also then later on, a couple of years later, came out with the Jerusalem Declaration and did the same form of PR. You don't get an article in the New York Times. And by the way, if you look at the way in which they orchestrated and conducted the whole campaign, it's very slick. It's the same basic framework. The Cultural Leaders Campaign in December and later on the Jerusalem Declaration that came out in March. It's essentially copy and paste. It's the same process. And in both cases, they had a major public relations firm on the Jerusalem Declaration, the Berlin Declaration. The journalists who received notification, and that's how they pushed it in the media, were told to contact for further information both Schiller-Springorum and also a Washington-based public relations firm that's linked to the progressives in the Democratic Party. So there seems to be a very close connection there. This costs money. I doubt that the public relations firm did it for free. They certainly haven't said that they did. So there's probably good money in there, whether it comes from the Berlin Technica Universität or some other source that needs to be demonstrated. Oops, sorry, folks, I set myself up the timer on. So the question of where the money comes from is important and needs to be checked. Also, there are links to the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which is the political foundation. All German political parties represented in the Bundestag get a large amount of money, millions of euros every year, to promote their political campaigns outside of Germany under the facade or the heading of promoting democracy. The Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is associated with and run by the Linke, which is the former communist East German political foundation, and they've been linked to this effort. And some of the people that they have funded are also involved in suggesting, writing new forms of alternative forms of defining anti-Semitism. And I don't think I have to say to you, to most of the audience here, that there's something very problematic. I use that very carefully. There's a lot of stronger words. And having German political radicals run a campaign to try to define and replace the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. At minimum, it's extremely offensive and insensitive that Germans are doing this. Another German source of funding seems, or certainly support, is something called the Medico International, which is a well-known, very well-funded German NGO that is very virulently anti-Israel in many of its activities. Then come into the process a number to give this legitimacy. You recruit other Jewish groups. Now notice that this is just before the big announcement, the big splash of the so-called Jerusalem Declaration, where you have, again, a big media campaign that a number of what they call a progressive Israel network in the United States opposes codification of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which, as we all know, is a straw person. Now, I understand we use the term straw person, not straw man. And this is groups like the Amenu, Americans for Peace Now, Habanim Dror, Hashomer Tzair, J Street, the New Israel Fund, all of those organizations come out with a strong opposition to the codification of the IHRA working definition. And that also paves the way for delegitimizing the process. A couple of weeks later, we have Peter Beinart. Progressives should loudly push back against the Biden administration's apparent embrace of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. And then what he adds to this is there's no right to a Jewish state. I'm not going to try to counter Beinart's claims, because I think that in any case it's a very bogus set of arguments. But here it is, right there in front of it. There is no right, Jews don't have a right to state. Now, why Peter Beinart, one can always speculate psychologically or otherwise why Beinart has jumped onto this anti-Israel bandwagon, but the fact that he comes out again trying to persuade the Biden administration not to embrace the IHRA working definition and instead go to the alternative. And here, Jewish Voice for Peace, again, J Street University, again, they use all the same language. Everybody repeats themselves one after another. It's an orchestrated campaign. Here we have the exchange on Twitter that I posted summarizing what I just said to you. And here we have Avram Burg, who I believe is still on the board of directors of the New Israel Fund, and where he comes out and he says that Professor Stephanie Schuller-Springorum is one of the best, a sensitive, brilliant intellectual, though he doesn't deal with the substance, belongs to an increasing group, Jews and non-Jews alike, of people who all see all humans as equal and resist the weaponization of anti-Semitism as a simplistic political tool. That's Avram Burg, who I won't go through his whole history and background of self-promotion, which has become so central over the last few years. But the fact that this is the language that he uses and the form that it takes in promoting the demonization, delegitimization of the IHRA working definition, which, as I said, in a way he reinforces my argument that this is in fact led by German radicals, particularly Schuller-Springorum, in which a number of Israelis and Jews have signed on, unfortunately given legitimacy. And that was, of course, part of the plan. They were very clever. How do you get this completely ridiculous fringe text to get legitimacy? You get a bunch of important Jews, not so important Jews, others, Israelis, to sign on. I think the most visible and legitimate of the signatories, most surprising for me, was to see Professor Michael Walzer sign on. But to his credit, within a couple of weeks, he realized that this was not where he wanted to be. And he wrote a piece in Fathom in which he came out strongly in favor of the IHRA working definition as it was being debated by faculty and staff in University of London, University College of London. And there he says, I hope that they will defend the IHRA as I would do were I with them. And this is I would have preferred it if Professor Walzer, what Michael would have said, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have signed the working definition. He didn't want to go that far. Very few of my academic colleagues, I will include myself in that, are willing to say in public we were taken in by a scam. But I think that's what the implications are in this case. I'm going to end. Oops, not ready yet. Don't take me off. previous. Okay, I'm going to end on going back to Fiamma's main theme, and that is the implementation of the IHRA working definition by governments, not in the form of using it in a codification and a legal codification, but to guide policy. One of the most important aspects, and one that I'm personally very involved in, is the issue of funding this vast NGO industry that is very much responsible for the demonization of Israel. Go back to Durban and the NGO Forum and the 1,500 NGOs that were invited and brought to Durban, leading the poisonous anti-Semitic campaigns there and continuing to do so. And I think most significantly in there, the global, very powerful, very wealthy NGOs, Human Rights Watch. Again, we could spend hours, and I've written about this at great length, documenting Human Rights Watch and Ken Roth in particular's very personal obsession with attacking and undermining the legitimacy of Israel. All one has to do is look at his daily tweets to see how obsessed he is. But now what we're seeing, and the vast NGO network, much of which is funded by the European governments and the European Union, and among the issues that the EU has officially stated it will be part of its policy, is to apply the working definition, or referencing the working definition, in funding for its various types of grants and contractors, including the NGO community. As part of the framework to support, control, and as part of support and control and supervision mechanisms to ensure that funding does not go to entities and projects that promote anti-Semitism or other forms of hate, specifically referencing the IHRA working definition. This is extremely important. It's important in the specific context of the EU. It's important in the broader context of the member states. And again, this document, this handbook for the practical use of the IHRA working definition, that term is very important here. And on that I will come to a close before I get deep again. That it's extremely important that they talk about this specifically. They set guidelines for the member states and international organizations in their broad policy frameworks, including funding mechanisms. Something that is also recommended for other governments involved in NGOs. It's something that I have, an NGO monitor, has recommended to members of Congress in overseeing funding that's being renewed for Palestinian NGOs in the context of what the US government sees as a renewed peace process. And so I think that the implementation, specifically the points that Fiamma made, I'm going to end on a more optimistic note than Fiamma. I do think that despite the attacks on the working definition, I think they're very clumsy. I think those attacks can be defeated, and I think they are being defeated. And I do think that the implementation will go forward as long as we continue to hold both the organizations and their funders and enablers and the broader international community hold their feet to the fire in terms of not allowing the anti-Semitism, the rhetoric of anti-Semitism, the imagery of anti-Semitism, and the basic frameworks in which anti-Semitism is explained as simply being legitimate criticism of Israel. If we can continue to hold all the members of the international community to that definition, I think that this process will continue and move forward. At this point, I will end.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Gerald Steinberg. You might want to check a couple of chat messages that I've seen during the course of the next few minutes, and perhaps you might want to respond an interesting comment. I now pass the floor to my friend and colleague, Diker. Please, we have a musical chairs going on here, so I have to move.
I will mute.
Thank you, Chairman Baker, Ambassador Baker, and Fiamma. Congratulations on this very important policy study, double message, double standard, institutions abandoning the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, court danger. This is a dramatic moment, I think, for all of us. And I think there is reason for encouragement and there is reason for alarm. Fiamma has been a guardian of the rights of the Jewish people in the diaspora and in the democratic and Jewish nation state of Israel for over 20 years. For over 30 years. She's written some 20 books. So this is not a new theme for Fiamma to write about anti-Semitism. It's a continuum. But what is new about this book and what is a fresh contribution to the international community? And I want to extend a very warm buongiorno to our friends in Italy who are watching on radio and listening to the broadcast on Radio Radicale, and other friends in the United States and in Europe and around the world. Because what Fiamma has offered us is really a blueprint for enforcing the values and the principles and the guidelines and the official blueprint of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance 2016 working definition. As Ambassador Baker and Professor Steinberg noted, this is a problematic blueprint because it's not enforceable legally. It is simply a moral mandate that the EU 27 has taken upon itself. The United States, Canada, and other democracies in Latin America have taken upon themselves. But nonetheless, we have a major issue with its implementation. And before I get into what some of the good news is about what this policy book offers us in discussing the IHRA, I want to just note one thing that Professor Steinberg said in noting one of his colleagues, Professor Michael Walzer, one of the great political philosophers of our era, who mistakenly signed on to the Jerusalem Declaration. Well, it appears to me, just to begin in a way from the end, to talk about having an implementation committee that is mandated by the IHRA Working Definition Community of Nations. And their role would be to contact scholars and diplomats and government officials who do not enforce or uphold the principles of the IHRA definition when they are so clearly in violation. It seems to me that a voluntary implementation committee might be a good way to start, because Professor Walzer certainly would want to remain worthy of his great illustrious career at Princeton and not violate the clear blueprint of the IHRA definition. So the good news in Fiamma's book here is that she calls to account international institutions who have not upheld their commitment to IHRA. She asked the question in a number of examples: why is it that following the 2016 acceptance of the IHRA definition, did the IHRA working group not call out former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir bin Mohamad, who said Jews have hooked noses and Israel should disappear from the map because Israel is the center of all of the problems in the Middle East? A clear Nazi-like eliminationist type of comment that went completely unanswered. Fiamma asked the question, why? How is it? How is it that Mahmoud Abbas, the chairman of the Palestinian Authority, stands up in June of 2016 in front of the European Parliament and says that Israeli rabbis have suggested to the government of Israel that they poison the water of the Palestinian Authority? It is absolutely extraordinary that at that, and you can see this if you put on the YouTube, that Chairman Abbas received a standing ovation from the European Parliament at the end of his speech, when in its middle, he advanced one of the great medieval blood libels of medieval Europe. Why is it, Fiamma Nirenstein asked finally in her, in the opening pages of this blueprint, of this guide, to understand institutional anti-Semitism, did Mahmoud Abbas say to French President Emmanuel Macron that the Jews desecrate Al-Aqsa with their filthy feet? a clear anti-Semitic trope that went unanswered by His Excellency, President Macron. So Nirenstein asks in this book, why is it that those that have taken upon themselves the definition are not enforcing it upon others and are not upholding those values and principles, notwithstanding the important comment that my colleague, Ambassador Baker, the longtime legal advisor of the Israel Foreign Ministry, who has said there is no legal enforcement and therefore we rely on moral enforcement. Nonetheless, the less good news about today, ladies and gentlemen, is that there is reason for great alarm as throughout Europe and the United States, unprecedented spike in anti-Semitism and violent acts against Jews are taking place. And Israel, the nation state of the Jewish people, is being used as the pretext in nearly all of the attacks that we are seeing in Europe and in the United States. The very alarming news that Fiamma Nirenstein brings to us is that what we are witnessing is, I believe, a problem far greater than the IHRA solution. And Professor Steinberg asked, why is it that the IHRA definition is weak, not only because it has to be only morally self-enforcing, but the fact is that the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is that many of the international institutions, primarily the United Nations, its agencies such as the ICJ, and other international institutions such as the Council of Europe, the European Union, as well as the International Criminal Court, do not view the condemnation of Israel using rhetorical assaults, such as Israel genocide, Israel comparing Israel to the Nazis, comparing Israel directly to apartheid South Africa, calling Israel a genocidal war criminal. They do not believe that this is anti-Semitic language. They believe it is merely, as Professor Steinberg says, and I wrote in a analysis of the Jerusalem Post just yesterday or the day before, plain legitimate criticism of Israel. This is a problem of cognition and the failure of recognition of what political anti-Semitism is. Bernard Lewis, a teacher of Fiamma and a teacher of mine who was in this very room from which I speak, together with my colleagues, said and has wrote in a path-breaking article in 2005 in the American Scholar that political anti-Semitism is an ideological anti-Semitism against the Jewish collective, meaning Israel, and it is the only politically and socially acceptable anti-Semitism after racial and religious anti-Semitism no longer became acceptable in the West. This new political anti-Semitism based on ideological hatred and rejection of Israel is what the new form that those who combat anti-Semitism, and this is what Fiamma is trying very much to do with the blueprint for this book, Double Message, Double Standard, must do. Let me take you for 30 seconds to the context of what Fiamma has created in her book. There are three very important principles that Fiamma Nirenstein has listed in this book as defining the phenomenon of institutional anti-Semitism. One, she says that the three principles defining institutional anti-Semitism today are: one, the Nazification of Israel, meaning the Israelis do to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews. Number two, the denial of Jewish sovereignty to sovereign Jews in Israel, meaning the constant use of the baseless and factless and fictitious term OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territory, which has no basis in fact or law or history whatsoever. And my colleague, Alan Baker, who was one of the negotiators at Oslo and one of the leading international attorneys in Israel, is sitting to my right and can confirm what I'm telling you about the OPT, Occupied Palestinian Territories, in addition to other buzzwords that are anti-Semitic in nature, such as settler colonialism, such as Israeli genocide, and Israel as war criminal, etc. There is a history to all of this, ladies and gentlemen, and the history in the United Nations as the premier institution in the international community goes back to 1964, when the Soviet Union attempted to have Israel branded as Nazism as, Zionism as Nazism and Zionism as racism, in an act of vengeance against the United States, who at that time tried to get anti-Semitism as a form of racism passed in the United Nations General Assembly, and met fierce opposition by the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union set the stage for the Nazification of Israel, which is why every time that this notion of Israel as a quote unquote illegal occupier, as Fiamma and I discussed this morning, what is the term of reference? The historical term of reference was the former Nazi occupation of sovereign Europe. And that is the Nazification that is being applied to the collective Jew, meaning the state of Israel. Following this, the Soviet Union's paving this road, Yasser Arafat, the former chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization, 6 months after his organization massacred 30 people up in Ma'alot in northern Israel, was then invited to address the General Assembly of the leading international institution, in which he likened Israel to apartheid South Africa, thereby promoting Zionism as racism, and therefore recasting the Jewish collective as the embodiment of evil alongside the two other confirmed entities of evil: one, the former Nazi regime, and two, the former South African apartheid regime. And to recast the Jews in that context was to Nazify the Jews and have them embody the essence of evil alongside the Nazis and the apartheid government in the 20th century. That recasting, fast forward to the UN sanctioned 2001 Durban Conference, the World Conference on against Racism, Xenophobia, and Racial Intolerance and related intolerances. They called at the Durban Conference for the revisiting and the reaffirmation of the infamous UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, which had been passed a year after Arafat's speech at the United Nations and lasted for 16 years. So the international community had 16 years of the Nazification and the denial of the concept of the denial of sovereignty. Zionism is racism at the UN. That was then re-powered, re-energized at Durban. And then, as Fiamma points out in the book, this Israel as genocide, Israel as war criminal, Israel as apartheid, Israel as Nazi incarnation has then been used multiple times since the 2001 conference. In every conflict Israel has with jihadi organizations, whether it was the Al-Aqsa war of terror in 2001 to 2004, the 2009-2010 war against Iran-backed Hamas, the 2014 war against Iran-backed Hamas, and now just several months ago, the 2021 war against Iranian regime-backed Hamas. Israel once again referred to with anti-Semitic nomenclature of all of the adjectives that I mentioned to you during this 8 or 9 minutes that I've had with you. This is a major challenge, ladies and gentlemen, because it is not political criticism. The proof that it is not political criticism is that we are witness now to scores of other territorial conflicts around the world. China, Tibet, Morocco, Western Sahara. We are Turkey and Cyprus, India, and formerly India and Pakistan, but we have India and Kashmir. And in none of those, and by the way, Georgia and South Ossetia, and in none of those conflicts, neither side is referred to as a genocidal, apartheid, Nazi, war criminal in those territorial conflicts. Only Israel, the one small nation state, is referred to with this type of eliminationist language. And that leads me to the final point. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing is an ideological, political anti-Semitism and an ideological war to exterminate the concept of a Jewish nation state off the face of the earth. And it must be faced by confronted by people of goodwill with a complete intolerance for this type of language and for these types of direct political actions against the state of Israel. This is a national security threat to the state of Israel and to the Jewish people by extension. And it is, in my assessment, the state of Israel itself, through its National Security Council, through its ministries, through its parliament, must act and take the lead against this national security threat, against its very legitimacy and by extension, the legitimacy of the Jewish people around the world. We call upon you, our friends and colleagues and allies around the world, to join us in a no tolerance policy for this renewed political anti-Semitism, as Professor Bernard Lewis had coined it, because it is a dangerous development and one that unfortunately has been dressed in socially and politically acceptable terms. And so we call for your assistance in turning this back, and from your friends in Jerusalem, the Jewish people thank you, and the state of Israel will thank you for approaching and confronting and overcoming this threat. Thank you. And I'm going to introduce the star of today. She's a star every day, Fiamma Nirenstein, who is a scholar, a journalist, author of over 20 books on anti-Semitism and on Israel and on Europe and the relations between Europe and Israel in general. And she, as many of you know, was the deputy president of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Italian Parliament. She is here, lives in Israel with her husband and one child. And I'm going to give her the floor to make some of the salient points of this very important latest study, which I urge all of you to read. It's not long, and it will give you all the tools necessary to help win this critical fight. Thank you.
First of all, it's difficult to speak now after everything has been said already by my friends that I thank very, very deeply. I mean, I thank them to be here with me today. We have always been together for many years, but most of all, I thank them because these are people that have really done something in the struggle against anti-Semitism, something really important. Alan Baker, let's say, he has done so many things, but if it was not for him, nothing really basic I would have been saying about the crazy way that the question of the territories is defined all over the world. Alan has countered this with such an immense knowledge of the problem and giving us all the weapons to fight this difficult battle. Then Gerald, without Gerald and his work with the NGO, we wouldn't know anything about how much the international institutions have been pushing up the ideological and even practical fight. When I say practical, I mean also terrorist fight against Israel. Gerald, with immense courage, has been defining it and explaining it. And without Dan, we wouldn't put in its right place all the question of BDS, which is nowadays the main question at the center of the discussion, because on this question, all the discussion about political criticism and anti-Semitism is discussed, and then has demonstrated that it is not a matter of political criticism, a matter of anti-Semitism, and this is something that you can find in his work and in his books, and it's so very, very important. I want to thank Rebecca Mieli and Ben Hyton for the great help that they have given with their research that you will find in this little book. This book is little, but is very, very dense. Its density is mostly connected to the work that they have done, putting together our ideas. And the idea is very simple. The idea is, it's not only that the institution have not been able to be faithful to the definition of the IHRA. The point is that the institution, instead of fighting anti-Semitism, have put down the basis for the contemporary anti-Semitism with plenty of declarations, letters, fixations about several themes that have never been really treated as discussed as they should have been, with knowledge and with participation. They have been put down just as a matter of repetition and habits, and you know, and sometimes really with a lack of knowledge of the theme. And when I say this, I really refer to the behavior of the Israeli army, to the question of the territories, and to the Iranian question. The three main pillars that are described there are the main sources of the contemporary anti-Semitism. Now, I will not go through again all the description of what is inside the book. It's easy to find, it's easy to read, and it's very short. So you will find it easily and you will see. But I want to say that I don't know if you had the occasion to witness in these last days the inauguration of the new president of Iran. Yes, I mean, Raisi is his name. And he invited, and they were all present, 75 nations to be present to his inauguration. And among them, sitting in the second row, there was the deputy foreign minister of the European Union, whose name is Enrique Mora. Because after a discussion, the foreign minister of the European Union, Borrell, decided that yes, he would accept the invitation of Iran. So this guy was sitting in the second row, and while on the front row, you could see Ismail Haniyeh, you could see Naim Qassem, the deputy of Nasrallah. I mean, you could see all the bosses, the leaders of the terrorist organizations that are on the blacklist of the European Union. What could be a more blatant confirmation of the inability of the European Union of being a trustable subject on the issue of anti-Semitism, while we know that, first of all, Iran has made of anti-Semitism and of the promise of killing all the Jews, destroying the state of the Jewish people, the state of Israel, and the other organizations sitting in the front row have made their first engagement and promise the anti-Semitic flag. So how can afterwards the European Union, who has been among the discussant and the promoter and the institution that always pretends that is fighting anti-Semitism, be the one that we believe to, that we trust in the fight about this fundamental issue that nowadays implies the fight against terrorism and the general fight in the world for peace and stability, not only in the Middle East, but all over the world. And then there is another question that I would like to put down. Tell me, what is the difference between Ben and Jerry decision of not distributing their ice cream in the territories, and the decision of the European Union of labeling and giving guidelines about the territories? Please tell me, what is the difference? How then can they afterwards come up and say that they fight against BDS and then they prohibit BDS? Can they say that they are against the BDS when they according to their guidelines, ask the supermarket of all the world to put labels just like the Nazi put labels on the Jewish products before Nazism. So what is the difference? So now I was born after the Second World War, like the institution that I'm talking about, the United Nations, the European Union, and when there was a renewal, included the United States of the concept of what the government of the people should be used for. What should it be? What they owe us, the Jewish people, a promise. They have promised us that they were just standing up to fight against what had been happening during the Second World War. I mean, if the European Union is there, it is just there because it has to fight against anti-Semitism. This is the secret of the European Union. This is the idea that is behind the European Union. This is what they must do. They must do it not for us. They must do it for themselves. Otherwise, they better disappear because they don't have any reason to exist. Otherwise, we go back at what was the world before that. So this is what we request for them: fight anti-Semitism, cancel the guidelines, stop repeating the trope of the territories. Dan has already been saying here what we repeat in a choir together, that no one touches the issue of the Chinese territories or the Moroccan territories. They always have something to do with that. And it was very right, and I will finish with that because I don't want to go through all the book. The book is very interesting, mostly because of the research of our boys, and I'm very glad about that. My pages are a thought about it, but the research is important because the research demonstrates that there is a consequence, that when you have, for instance, the Goldstone report, when during the war in Gaza of the 2009 and then in 2014, and they ask us repeatedly that our behavior must be balanced, as if our behavior was naturally unbalanced, as if we were characterized by the wish of killing Palestinians, as if we wanted to kill Palestinian children. Even Merkel repeated that, even this time when it was so clear that we had been attacked by 4,500 missiles and the dynamics were so evident. No, but they cannot refrain. They cannot refrain for repeating that, yes, we are in favor of the Israeli right of self-defense, but this self-defense must be balanced, and we must have, please, as many deaths as the other have. No matter if we have the come si chiama? Kippat Barzel. How do you say it in English? The Iron Dome. This is not important. We should expose ourselves to die in a number that would satisfy everybody.
We should send back the same number of
or
rockets.
We should send the same number of rockets. Exactly. Yeah, we could send back 4,500 rockets. That would be a disaster. That would be proportional. Okay. No, but what I was saying now, look, Gerald touched a very important point. There is a fight against the IHRA, because the IHRA is very important. And I will finish with this. Why is it very important? It's very, very true that the IHRA doesn't have teeth, as Alan Baker said, and also that the IHRA has a lot of enemies, as Gerald Steinberg said. But the IHRA has broken a very important glass, the glass that say that don't touch the left, please, when you speak about anti-Semitism. This has been broken, because before that, when you spoke about anti-Semitism, you always related to the right. I mean, Nazi, fascist, ex-Nazi, ex-fascist, post-Nazi, post-fascist, populist right, on the right. When you go inside the IHRA that says be careful. Nowadays, just like Martin Luther King said, so he was not on the right, he was already with us, okay? And on the left. But he said, be careful when you say something against Israel. The truth is that you are saying this against the Jews. This was Martin Luther King, okay? And the IHRA says exactly the same. You go against the Jews, going against Israel. And be careful, whoever you are, even if you are on the left, you are anti-Semitic anyhow. So the IHRA has broken such an important ideological glass. That's the way we have to keeping it alive. We have to defend the IHRA. This is the very point. It's the ideological and political point that has to be kept, even if it is difficult, even if it has so many enemies. And how do we do that? We do it with our courage. We don't give up. It is so different today. We have the state of Israel. The state of Israel will not allow anti-Semitism to become dangerous for the Jews. And I say this to all the Jews all over the world. Don't worry, we are here. I mean, when I say we, I'm Italian, I'm Israeli. I'm very glad to be both the things. But I feel so very much Israeli when I speak about anti-Semitism, because that's the way I can promise that Israel will defend the Jews. How? This is a matter for another discussion. We will do it, I hope, also with all of these friends now that we are approaching the date when there is this request for a fourth conference about just repeating the Durban tropes. We will be against it and we will be tough. We will not say, oh yes, no, but we will be just a little bit the way you like. No, we will not be the way we like. You like, we will defend ourselves. We will keep being the land of the Jewish people. And when you will aggress us, you will aggress the Jewish people. So you will be anti-Semite. This is it.
Very good. Good.
Yeah. Thank you, Fiamma, and thank you, Professor Steinberg and Dan Diker. On the issue of balance that Fiamma referred to, let me just recall in one of the previous bouts of violence between Israel and Hamas, I found myself on a panel together with, I think it was a foreign minister, the UK foreign minister. I think his name was Clegg or something like that. But in any event, he came out with this amazing expression that more Palestinians than Israelis have been killed. So I asked him, I said, well, would you be happier if more Israelis would be killed? Yes, he would. And he really didn't know what to say. We still have some minutes for comments and questions by participants in this discussion. So please feel free to raise your hands and let us know, and we'll give you the floor.
Alan, there's a question that was posed in the chat, not in the chat, but in the Q&A, which I'd like to answer.
Go ahead.
An anonymous attendee, I would prefer to know who I'm talking to, but anyway, asked a good question. It's hard to marginalize or discredit important Jews on the political left. So if we can't dialogue with them, we should try not to conflate them with the larger scale, international, covertly funded platforms aligning on other issues with general anti-Israel, anti-Zionist positions. I think we can dialogue with some of them. I think it's important to try to dialogue with those important Jews, and you put it in quotation marks, in the political left. If you follow my Twitter feed, you'll see that I do that. I also do that in all sorts of other frameworks. We've got to put our case on the line and put them in a position where they have to explain why it is that they've joined into this. And I don't think they're doing a good job. I think they generally demonstrate that what they're really using, what they're doing by opposing the IHRA working definition, by promoting this German alternative, in quotes, what they're really doing is they're expressing, if we go beyond the psychological factors, I think they're expressing a very deep hostility, political position within the context of Israeli and Jewish politics. I don't like this term, really, a far left position. And there are many ways that can be done But as I have for 20 years argued, and none of us have said, if you oppose Israeli policies on the territories in the West Bank, occupation, post 67, and you think that it's Israel's fault and not the Palestinians' fault, there's no peace. Find something other than boycotts, because boycotts really are an anti-Semitic tool. Not the issue is when you do boycotts, you're not, in fact, having a serious political discussion. What you're doing is you're slamming a door and joining the one-staters. If you look at the BDS symbols, and Dan's written about this a lot, that it's all about Israel's right to exist. The symbols are Palestine from the river to the sea, and many of the BDS leaders and activists talk about Israel not having a right to exist. Peter Beinart talks about one state a lot now too. Why do we need a Jewish state? And that's okay. If that's your position, then you've stated it. And if it's not your position, then use something other than the boycott movement in order to promote that position. So I think that bottom line is I think that one can at least try to have a dialogue with critics. I think that's important to do. I just want to add a couple other quick points and comments on what Dan and what Fiamma said. Dan, I want to say, first of all, what you wrote in your op-ed in the Jerusalem Post yesterday is extremely important. Putting all these issues, not just in a webinar, but on paper where others can read it. I think moral mandates are important. They're not trivial. They, especially now in the 21st century, where so much is defined by virtue signaling and by being woke and progressive, we have to be part of the moral debate. I think that's the biggest failure of the human rights, so-called human rights community. More than anything else, our anger at Ken Roth and Human Rights Watch should be directed at their completely immoral actions that have destroyed the whole foundation of post-Shoah, post-Holocaust human rights. That's where the whole human rights movement came from. That's where the Universal Declaration of 1948 is based on, as a reaction to the horrors of the Shoah. And by exploiting and abusing and destroying the whole movement for personal vendettas about Israel, that's something that morally, that's not a legal issue, but it's a moral issue that I think we have to confront. I think that also is something that plays into the point that Fiamma made about the European Union's existence. The whole structure, the European economic community, the rapprochement between Germany and France after the war came out of the horrors of the Second World War and the Shoah in Germany, Nazi Germany. And the European Union needs to be reminded that that's the raison d'etre. That's why they exist, and to become involved in promoting all of these campaigns against Israel, the right of the Jews to self-determination in our homeland. All of that is really, it undermines the foundations of the European enterprise. And if I'm correctly expanding on what Fiamma said, then I think that's an important point to emphasize.
Thank you. With respect to the comment by Art Brownstein, let me just on the Oslo, whether there's a Palestinian state or not, or sovereignty, I'll be happy to discuss that with you. It's not really for this this particular discussion, but happily I'll discuss it. There isn't a sovereign Palestinian state. That wasn't the intention of Oslo. I was there, I participated in it, and I drafted most of the documentation. But we can discuss this. And does anybody else want to make a comment or ask a question? If that's the case, so let me thank you again, all of you, for participating. Let me thank our panelists.
And thanks, Daniel.
And thank Daniel Levine, who is our anonymous technician sitting on the side and conducting this orchestra. Thank you very much.